I'm Angela Crust, 28 years old, and I built my career from long nights of policy research that no one thought would amount to much. For years, I carried my family's expectations, giving everything I had to earn a kind of respect that never came. But when my own father leaned over at a family gathering and whispered to our relatives, "She's completely worthless," I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone who should have been your biggest supporter? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being written off, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. Growing up in our house meant learning to read the temperature of a room before you entered it. My father had a way of filling every space with his presence, not the warm, protective kind that other kids talked about, but something sharper, more calculating. He measured everything: the shine on his shoes, the crease in his pants, the way his voice carried when he told stories to company. What mattered to him was how things looked from the outside, not what they cost the people living them. I was 7 when I first noticed the pattern. We'd been at my aunt's birthday party, and I'd spent the afternoon helping in the kitchen while my cousins played video games. When it came time to serve the cake, I carried plates without being asked, cleared empty glasses, made sure the older relatives had napkins. My father watched from across the room, nursing his beer and laughing with my uncles about work, sports, whatever men talked about when they clustered together like that. On the drive home, I waited for him to say something about how I'd helped. Instead, he glanced at me in the rearview mirror and shook his head. "You don't have to try so hard," he said. "People notice when you're being desperate for attention." The words hit differently than I expected. I hadn't been trying to get attention. I'd been trying to be useful, the way my mother had taught me. But something in his tone made me question everything I'd done that afternoon. Maybe I had been too eager. Maybe other people saw something pathetic in my willingness to help. That became the soundtrack of my childhood, the constant recalibration of my actions against his judgment. When I brought home good grades, he'd flip through the report card and mention the 1 B+ among the A's. When I made the honor roll, he'd ask why I wasn't student council president too. When I did make student council president, he wondered aloud whether it was because the other kids felt sorry for me. The cruelest part wasn't that he never praised me, it was that his standards shifted like sand beneath my feet. There was no target I could hit because he moved it every time I got close. Success in his eyes wasn't about achievement, it was about effortless superiority, the kind of natural brilliance that didn't require work or discipline or the grinding persistence that came naturally to me. My younger brother understood this instinctively. Danny had inherited my father's easy charm, his ability to win people over without trying. When Danny scored a goal in soccer, it was natural talent. When he made people laugh, it was charisma. When he forgot his homework or showed up late to family dinners, it was endearing absent-mindedness. The rules that applied to me, punctuality, preparation, politeness, seemed suspended when it came to Danny. At family gatherings, I watched my father's face light up when Danny walked into the room. There was genuine pride there, uncomplicated and warm. Danny would throw an arm around Dad's shoulders, make some joke that had everyone laughing, and bask in the approval that I'd been chasing my entire life. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was different, more serious, more focused on things that actually mattered. But late at night, when the house was quiet and I was finishing homework that Danny had abandoned hours earlier to watch TV, I felt the weight of that difference. It wasn't just that my father preferred him, it was that he seemed to see Danny as naturally worthy of love, while I had to earn it through performance. And no matter how well I performed, it was never quite enough. The summer I turned 16, I decided to stop trying so hard. I'd gotten into a prestigious academic program at the state university, something that required applications and interviews and recommendations. When I told my parents, my mother hugged me and started planning how we'd celebrate. My father nodded and asked if the program paid anything. When I said no, that it actually cost money for materials and transportation, he frowned. "Seems like a lot of work for something that doesn't lead anywhere," he said. "You sure you want to spend your summer in classrooms instead of getting a real job?" I spent that night staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if he was right. Maybe the program was just another way of trying too hard, another desperate grab for the kind of recognition that would always slip through my fingers. Maybe I should get a job at the mall like my friends, make some money, have some fun for once. But when morning came, I knew I couldn't do it. Not because I was desperate for attention or trying to prove something to him, but because I genuinely wanted to learn. The program offered courses in policy analysis and government structure, subjects that fascinated me in a way that felt separate from my father's approval or disapproval. For the first time, I was choosing something purely for myself. That realization should have felt liberating, but it didn't. Instead, it highlighted how much of my life had been shaped by his expectations, even when I was rebelling against them. I'd been so focused on either meeting or rejecting his standards that I'd never developed my own. The program became my first step toward figuring out what those might look like. The classes were harder than anything I'd encountered in high school, but I thrived on the challenge. We studied case studies in public administration, analyzed policy outcomes, debated the role of government in solving complex social problems. My classmates were the kind of serious, driven students I'd always felt comfortable around, people who didn't apologize for caring about things that mattered. When I came home each evening, tired but energized by what I'd learned, my father would ask perfunctory questions about my day. But I could see in his eyes that he was already dismissing whatever I might tell him. This was just another phase, another way for his overly serious daughter to avoid the real world where charm and connections mattered more than careful analysis and hard work. I stopped trying to explain why the program excited me. Instead, I threw myself deeper into the work, writing papers that went beyond the minimum requirements, staying after class to continue discussions with professors, volunteering for additional research projects. My father's indifference became background noise, less painful than it used to be but still present, like a low-grade headache you learn to ignore. By the end of the summer, I decided to major in public policy in college. It felt like the first choice I'd ever made that was truly mine, not a reaction to my father's expectations, not an attempt to win his approval, but a genuine alignment between my interests and my goals. I was 18 years old, and I was finally beginning to understand who I might become. Small comments had always been my father's weapon of choice. He was too smart and too concerned with appearances to be openly cruel, but he had a gift for the perfectly timed observation that could deflate confidence or redirect a conversation away from my achievements. At first, I dismissed these moments as teasing, the rough affection that some families used instead of direct praise. But as I got older, the pattern became impossible to ignore. During my sophomore year of college, I'd been selected for a competitive internship with a congressman's office. When I called home to share the news, my mother was thrilled, asking questions about what I'd be doing and whether this might lead to other opportunities. My father listened quietly, then asked if I was sure I was qualified for something like that. "These political jobs usually go to kids whose parents have connections," he said. "You sure they didn't make some kind of mistake?" The comment lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. I spent the next several days second-guessing everything about the selection process, wondering if there had been some error, if I'd be exposed as unworthy the moment I showed up for work. It took a conversation with my advisor to remind me that I'd earned the position through my grades, my essay, and my interview performance. No mistakes, no charity, just merit. But the damage was already done. Even as I threw myself into the internship work, researching policy positions and drafting briefing memos, part of my mind was braced for the moment when someone would realize I didn't belong there. My father's doubt had become a voice in my head, questioning every success and magnifying every small mistake. At family gatherings, the comments became more public. During my cousin's graduation party, I mentioned that I'd been asked to stay on with the congressman's office part-time during the school year. Instead of congratulating me, my father turned to my uncle and stage whispered, "She's always working so hard to impress people. I keep telling her she doesn't need to try so desperately." The table went quiet for a moment before my aunt quickly changed the subject, but I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Later, when we were clearing dishes, she pulled me aside. "Don't take it personally," she said. "Your father's just not good at expressing pride. He's probably worried you're pushing yourself too hard. But I could see in her eyes that even she didn't quite believe what she was saying. This wasn't about concern or awkward affection, it was something else, something that required me to be diminished for him to feel comfortable. I started to understand that my achievements didn't just fail to impress him, they seemed to actively irritate him, as if my success was somehow a criticism of his own choices. The realization was both devastating and clarifying. I'd spent years trying to decode what would finally earn his approval, assuming that the right combination of achievements and humility would unlock his pride. But what if the problem wasn't that I hadn't succeeded enough? What if the problem was that I'd succeeded at all? During my junior year, I was selected for a prestigious fellowship that would place me with a senior policy advisor in Washington. The selection process had been brutal. Essays, interviews, recommendations, and only 12 students nationwide were chosen. When the acceptance email arrived, I sat in my dorm room staring at the screen, afraid to feel too excited until I'd shared the news with someone. I called home that evening, expecting at least neutral acknowledgement of the honor. My mother was over the moon, immediately starting to plan how they'd visit me in Washington. But when my father got on the phone, his first question was whether the fellowship paid enough to cover my expenses. "These government things usually expect you to work for free," he said. "Seems like a lot of trouble for something that won't help you get a real job afterward." I tried to explain that the fellowship would give me direct experience in policy development, that the connections I'd make could be invaluable for my career. But I could hear in his silence that he'd already dismissed everything I was saying. To him, this was just another example of my tendency to choose impressive-sounding opportunities that wouldn't lead to practical outcomes. After I hung up, I sat alone in my room trying to process the conversation. Part of me had expected his reaction. I'd been preparing for it, actually, but it still stung more than I'd anticipated. This wasn't just indifference anymore. There was something active in his dismissal, something that felt almost like contempt. That night, I called my best friend from high school, someone who'd known my family for years. When I described the conversation, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know this isn't normal, right?" she finally said. "My parents would have been bragging to the entire neighborhood if I'd gotten something like that fellowship. Hell, they bragged when I made the dean's list." Her words forced me to confront what I'd been avoiding, that my father's behavior wasn't just a different style of parenting or a cultural quirk about not wanting to spoil me with praise. It was deliberate undermining, a systematic effort to make me doubt my own worth and abilities. The question I couldn't answer was why he needed to do that, what purpose it served in his understanding of our relationship. Over the following months, as I prepared for the fellowship, I started paying closer attention to how he talked about me to other people. At family dinners and social gatherings, I'd position myself where I could overhear his conversations, looking for clues about how he really saw me. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. He had a repertoire of stories about my quirks, how I was too serious, too focused on things that didn't matter, too naive about how the real world worked. He told these stories with the fond exasperation that other parents used when talking about genuinely endearing childhood mishaps, but the underlying message was clear. I was someone to be indulged rather than respected, pitted rather than admired. The most painful part was watching other people's reactions. Some laughed along, taking their cue from his tone. Others looked uncomfortable, glancing at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. A few tried to redirect the conversation, offering their own praise for my achievements, but their efforts only seemed to encourage him to double down on his gentle mockery. I began to realize that these moments weren't accidents or careless slips. They were performances, carefully calibrated to establish his position as the reasonable, grounded parent dealing with an overly ambitious daughter who didn't understand her own limitations. By positioning me as trying too hard, he positioned himself as effortlessly superior, someone who understood what really mattered in life. The fellowship in Washington changed everything for me, though not in ways I could have predicted. Working directly with senior policymakers, I discovered that the skills I'd been developing, careful research, thorough analysis, attention to detail, were not only valued but essential. The work was challenging and meaningful, exactly the kind of environment where my natural inclinations toward discipline and thoroughness were seen as strengths rather than character flaws. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who took ideas seriously, who believed that careful policy analysis could make a real difference in people's lives. My supervisor, a woman who'd spent 20 years in government service, became an informal mentor, helping me understand not just the technical aspects of the work, but the broader significance of what we were doing. "You have good instincts," she told me during one of our regular check-ins. "You ask the right questions, and you're not satisfied with superficial answers. That's rarer than you might think, especially among people your age." Her words meant more to me than I could express, partly because they came without any agenda or qualification. She wasn't my parent trying to shape my behavior, or my professor trying to encourage a struggling student. She was a professional who'd worked with hundreds of young people, and she saw something valuable in my approach to the work. As the fellowship progressed, I found myself caring less and less about my father's opinion of what I was doing. The validation I'd been seeking from him was coming from sources that actually mattered: colleagues who understood the work, supervisors who could assess my contributions objectively, mentors who'd succeeded in the field I was entering. His dismissal began to feel not just wrong but irrelevant. The shift wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no moment of liberation or decisive break. Instead, it was a gradual recognition that I'd been seeking approval from someone who was fundamentally unable to give it, not because of any failing on my part, but because of something broken in his understanding of what success looked like. I'd been trying to prove myself to someone who'd already decided that my kind of achievement didn't count. During the spring of my senior year, I was offered a full-time position with a policy research institute, the kind of opportunity that validated everything I'd been working toward. The job would allow me to continue the work I'd started during the fellowship, analyzing complex social issues and developing recommendations for government action. It was exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd first declared my major in public policy. When I called home to share the news, my mother was characteristically supportive, asking about salary and benefits and when I'd be starting. But when my father got on the phone, his response was predictably deflating. "Policy research," he repeated, as if testing the words. "That's like being a professional student, right? Just writing reports that no one reads." I tried to explain the Institute's influence, the way our recommendations shaped legislation and informed government decisions. But I could hear in his tone that he'd already categorized this as another one of my impractical choices, another example of my preference for impressive-sounding work over financially rewarding careers. After I hung up, I realized something had shifted. The conversation still stung, but it didn't shake my confidence the way similar conversations had in the past. I'd spent enough time around people who understood the value of policy work, who'd seen firsthand how careful analysis could influence important decisions. My father's dismissal said more about his limitations than mine. That spring evening marked the end of something I'd been carrying since childhood, the belief that his approval was necessary for my success to mean anything. I'd finally found work that aligned with my values and utilized my strengths, and his inability to understand or appreciate that work was his loss, not mine. The family dinner was supposed to be a celebration. My cousin Mark had just gotten engaged, and my aunt had insisted on hosting a big gathering to mark the occasion. The whole extended family would be there: grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in months. I'd driven down from the city, where I'd been settling into my new job at the Policy Institute, looking forward to catching up with everyone and sharing updates about my work. The evening started normally enough. My grandmother asked about my apartment, my mother showed everyone photos from my recent work conference, and my cousins wanted to hear about life in Washington. I felt relaxed in a way I hadn't in years, confident in my work and comfortable with where my life was heading. Even my father seemed to be in a good mood, telling stories about his latest project and laughing with my uncles about old times. After dinner, while the women were clearing dishes and setting out dessert, I overheard a conversation from the living room that made me pause. My uncle was asking my father about my new job, and I lingered in the doorway to hear his response. This was the test I'd been unconsciously preparing for. Would he finally acknowledge what I'd accomplished, or would he find another way to diminish it? What I heard was worse than dismissal. My father was leaning close to my uncle and cousin, his voice low but clear enough for me to catch every word. He was talking about how I'd always been the type to overcomplicate things, to choose difficult paths when simpler options were available. But then his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, and he said the words that cut through me like a blade. "She's completely worthless." The words hung in the air while my uncle and cousin exchanged glances. I expected them to defend me, to express shock at such a harsh assessment. Instead, they began to laugh, not the uncomfortable laughter of people caught off guard, but the genuine amusement of people who'd been invited into a shared joke. My cousin nodded knowingly, adding his own comment about how I'd always been too serious for my own good. I stood frozen in the doorway, dishes still in my hands, trying to process what I'd heard. This wasn't the casual teasing or gentle mockery I'd grown accustomed to over the years. This was something else entirely, a fundamental verdict on my worth as a person, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd given the matter careful thought. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I couldn't move from where I stood. Every achievement I'd worked for, every validation I'd received from professors and mentors and supervisors, seemed to evaporate in the face of those four words. Not disappointing or difficult or stubborn worthless. As if everything I'd done, everything I was, added up to nothing. I managed to finish clearing the table, moving through the motions while my mind reeled. During dessert, I sat quietly while conversations flowed around me, nodding when people spoke to me but unable to focus on anything they were saying. My father seemed completely normal, joking with my grandmother and complimenting my aunt on the meal. There was no indication that he'd just delivered the most devastating assessment of his daughter that I could imagine. The drive home was a blur. I kept replaying the moment, trying to convince myself that I'd misheard or misunderstood. But the words had been too clear, the context too obvious. He hadn't been making a careless comment or venting frustration about a specific incident. He'd been sharing his honest assessment of me with other family members, and they'd found it amusing rather than shocking. Back in my apartment, I sat on my couch staring at the wall, trying to understand how we'd reached this point. I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for his behavior, telling myself that he just wasn't good at expressing emotion or that his generation didn't believe in excessive praise. I'd convinced myself that beneath his criticism was a kind of tough love, a desire to push me to do better. But there was no love in what I'd heard that night. There was something close to contempt, a satisfaction in reducing me to nothing in front of people whose opinions mattered to him. He hadn't been trying to motivate me or protect me from overconfidence. He'd been deliberately undermining me, and he'd enjoyed it. The worst part wasn't the cruelty, it was the realization that this assessment had probably been forming for years, maybe decades. How many other conversations had there been? How many other moments when he'd shared this view of me with friends and relatives? How many people in my life had been looking at me through the lens of his judgment, seeing worthlessness where I thought they saw potential? I called in sick to work the next day, something I'd never done since starting the job. I spent the morning in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to move forward. Everything felt contaminated by what I'd heard, my work, my relationships, my sense of my own capabilities. If my own father saw me as completely worthless, what did that say about my judgment, my perception of myself, my understanding of my place in the world? By afternoon, I forced myself to get up and make coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to work through the situation logically. I wrote down every major achievement of the past few years, the academic honors, the fellowship, the job offer, the positive feedback from supervisors and mentors. On paper, the evidence seemed clear. I was competent, hardworking, and valued by people whose opinions should matter. But underneath that rational assessment was a deeper question that I couldn't logic my way past. If the person who'd known me longest and should love me most saw me as worthless, what did that say about who I really was? Maybe everyone else was being polite or temporary in their approval. Maybe my father was the only one honest enough to see past my desperate attempts to prove myself. The doubts multiplied through the evening, feeding on themselves until I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty. I'd built my entire adult identity around the belief that I was capable and valuable, that my work mattered and my efforts were worthwhile. One overheard conversation had shattered that foundation, leaving me scrambling to find solid ground. That night, I barely slept. When I did drift off, I had dreams about standing in rooms where everyone was laughing at me, where conversations stopped when I approached, where people exchanged knowing looks that confirmed what my father had always seen. I woke up exhausted, feeling like I'd been fighting battles all night without winning any of them. But something else had happened during those sleepless hours. Alongside the doubt and pain, a different feeling had begun to emerge, not anger exactly, but something harder and more focused. If my father saw me as worthless despite everything I'd accomplished, then his opinion was either wrong or meaningless. And if it was wrong, then I had no reason to keep seeking his approval. If it was meaningless, then I had every reason to stop caring what he thought. For the first time in my life, I began to consider the possibility that the problem wasn't with me, it was with him. The days after that dinner passed in a strange, suspended state. I went to work, attended meetings, wrote reports, and participated in all the normal activities of my new life, but everything felt muted and distant. My colleagues probably thought I was having trouble adjusting to the job, and I let them think that rather than trying to explain what had happened. How do you tell people that your father's casual cruelty has upended your understanding of yourself? I kept thinking about the laughter from my uncle and cousin. That sound haunted me more than my father's words, actually, because it suggested that his assessment of me wasn't just his private opinion, it was something others found plausible, even amusing. I started wondering how many family gatherings had included similar conversations, how many times my worth had been discussed and dismissed while I was in another room, oblivious. My mother called twice during that first week, cheerful conversations about work and life that made no reference to the dinner. Either she hadn't been part of the living room conversation, or she saw nothing unusual about what had been said. Both possibilities disturbed me in different ways. If she hadn't heard, it meant my father was strategic about when and where he shared these assessments. If she had heard and thought it was normal, then I'd been fundamentally misunderstanding my place in the family for years. I found myself analyzing every interaction we'd ever had, looking for signs I might have missed. The pattern was there once I knew to look for it, the way he dismissed my achievements, the subtle mockery disguised as concern, the tendency to redirect conversations away from my successes. But I'd been so focused on trying to earn his approval that I'd missed the deeper truth. He didn't want to approve of me. My success seemed to threaten something in his worldview that required me to remain small. The realization was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant I could stop trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle, stop contorting myself to meet standards that were designed to be unreachable. Devastating because it meant accepting that my father's love, if it existed at all, was conditional on my remaining lesser than him. During my second week back at work, my supervisor asked if everything was all right. She noticed that I seemed distracted during meetings, less engaged with the research projects I'd been excited about just days earlier. I considered telling her the truth, but how do you explain that you're questioning everything about yourself because of something your father said at a family dinner? Instead, I told her I was dealing with some family issues, which was true enough. She nodded sympathetically and offered to adjust my workload if I needed time to handle personal matters. Her kindness reminded me of something I'd been losing sight of, that there were people in my life who saw value in me, who wanted me to succeed, who judged me based on my actual contributions rather than some predetermined narrative about who I was supposed to be. That evening, I made a list of everyone who'd ever given me meaningful encouragement or recognition. Teachers who'd recommended me for advanced programs, professors who'd written strong letters of recommendation, supervisors who'd trusted me with important responsibilities. The list was longer than I'd expected, filled with people whose professional judgment I respected and whose approval I'd earned through merit rather than pleading. None of these people had ever suggested that I was trying too hard or needed to lower my expectations. None of them had ever implied that my achievements were somehow desperate or pathetic. They'd seen the same qualities my father criticized: thoroughness, persistence, seriousness, and valued them as strengths. The disconnect was stark enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. My father's assessment wasn't objective truth delivered with tough love, it was his personal limitation projected onto me. He needed me to be worthless to maintain his sense of superiority, to justify his own choices, to feel comfortable in his skin. My success threatened that comfort, so he developed an elaborate narrative that explained away everything I accomplished. The insight should have made me angry, but instead, it made me sad. Not sad for myself, I was beginning to see that I'd be fine, that I had the skills and support system to build a meaningful career and life. Sad for him, for whatever insecurity or fear made it necessary for him to tear down his own daughter to feel adequate. Sad for the relationship we might have had if he'd been capable of celebrating my achievements instead of resenting them. But underneath the sadness was something harder and more determined. I'd spent most of my life trying to win his approval, modifying my behavior and second-guessing my choices to avoid his criticism. That project was over now, not because I'd given up hope, but because I finally understood that his approval was worthless to me. I didn't want the kind of love that required me to diminish myself. I didn't want validation from someone who needed me to fail. The shift wasn't complete overnight. Old patterns of thought don't disappear that quickly, but it had definitely begun. When I caught myself wondering what he'd think about a work decision, I reminded myself that his opinion was no longer relevant to my choices. When I felt the familiar urge to downplay an achievement to avoid seeming like I was trying too hard, I forced myself to take full credit for what I'd accomplished. 3 weeks after that dinner, I got a call from my mother asking if I'd be able to come home for my grandmother's birthday the following month. My first instinct was to make an excuse, to avoid putting myself back in the environment where I'd been so thoroughly diminished. But then I realized that avoiding family gatherings would be giving my father exactly what he wanted: my absence, my silence, my acknowledgement that his judgment mattered more than my presence. Instead, I told my mother I'd be there, and I meant it. But I'd be coming as a different person than the one who'd left that last dinner in shock and pain. I'd be coming as someone who finally understood her own worth, regardless of who chose to recognize it. The decision felt like the first step towards something I'd never had before, not his approval, which I no longer wanted, but my own respect for the person I'd become despite his efforts to keep me small. I stopped calling home as frequently. The change wasn't dramatic or announced. I simply let the intervals between our conversations stretch from days to weeks. When my mother asked if everything was all right, I assured her it was, that I'd just been busy with work and settling into my new routine. She accepted the explanation without question, probably relieved that I wasn't pestering them with constant updates about my life. My father never called directly anymore, hadn't for years actually. Our communication had always been filtered through my mother, with him occasionally getting on the line to ask perfunctory questions about my job or apartment. Now even those brief exchanges stopped. If he noticed my decreased contact, he didn't mention it to my mother, at least not in any way that got back to me. The silence was strange at first. I'd been so conditioned to seek his input, to measure my decisions against his potential reactions, that his absence from my mental calculations left an odd empty space. But gradually, that space filled with other voices, mentors, colleagues, friends who'd proven themselves trustworthy judges of character and capability. Their feedback was more honest and more useful than his had ever been. At work, I threw myself into a major research project analyzing the effectiveness of federal education initiatives. The work was complex and demanding, exactly the kind of challenge I'd always thrived on. My supervisor gave me increasing responsibility as the project developed, and I found myself presenting findings to senior staff and occasionally to visiting officials from other agencies. The recognition was earned through competence, not granted as a favor or motivated by pity. During one particularly successful presentation, the division director made a point of complimenting my analysis afterward. "You have a gift for cutting through complexity and finding the core issues," she said. "That's exactly what we need in this field." Her words reminded me of everything I'd been trying to prove to my father over the years, that my careful, methodical approach to problems wasn't a character flaw, but a professional strength. I began to understand that his dismissal of my work style wasn't just personal cruelty, it was fundamental incomprehension. He operated in a world where charm and quick impressions mattered more than sustained effort and detailed analysis. My approach to life was not just different from his, it was antithetical to everything he valued. No wonder he'd never been able to appreciate what I was trying to accomplish. The realization brought a kind of peace I hadn't expected. I wasn't failing to meet his standards, I was succeeding by different standards that he couldn't understand or value. His inability to see worth in my achievements said nothing about their actual value and everything about his limitations as a judge. As weeks passed, I noticed other changes in how I moved through the world. I stopped apologizing for taking up space in meetings, stopped prefacing my opinions with unnecessary qualifications, stopped second-guessing my instincts about people and situations. The voice in my head that had always whispered warnings about trying too hard or appearing desperate began to fade, replaced by confidence based on actual results rather than external validation. My social life improved too. Without the constant background anxiety about whether I was being too serious or too ambitious, I relaxed into friendships that felt genuine rather than performed. Colleagues began inviting me to after-work gatherings, not because they felt sorry for me, but because they enjoyed my company. I started dating someone I'd met through work, someone who appreciated my intelligence and drive rather than finding them threatening or excessive. The relationship was a revelation. David was a researcher at a different institute, someone who understood the demands and rewards of policy work. When I told him about a successful project or an opportunity for advancement, his response was enthusiastic support rather than concern that I was pushing too hard. He never suggested that I tone down my ambitions or worry less about doing good work. For the first time, I was with someone who saw my dedication as attractive rather than problematic. "You're going to do important things," he told me one evening as we walked home from dinner. "I can see it in how you approach everything thoughtful, thorough, committed to getting it right. The world needs more people like that." His words hit me harder than I'd expected. Not because they were particularly profound, but because they represented such a complete reversal of the messaging I'd received at home. In my family, those same qualities had been sources of gentle mockery. Here, they were seen as strengths that made me valuable both professionally and personally. I started to wonder how different my life might have been if I'd grown up hearing that kind of encouragement instead of constant subtle criticism. How much time had I wasted trying to modify myself to fit someone else's limited vision of what I should be? How many opportunities had I second-guessed or downplayed because I'd internalized his doubt? But dwelling on those questions felt less productive than focusing on the future I was building. I had meaningful work, supportive relationships, and, for the first time, genuine confidence in my own judgment. My father's opinion had become irrelevant not because I was angry with him, but because I no longer needed external validation to know my own worth. The transformation wasn't complete. Old patterns of thought don't disappear overnight, but the foundation had shifted permanently. I was no longer seeking approval from someone incapable of giving it. Instead, I was building a life based on my own values and standards, surrounded by people who appreciated rather than merely tolerated who I was. When my mother called to finalize details about my grandmother's birthday party, I confirmed that I'd be there. But I knew I'd be attending as a fundamentally different person than the one who'd left that last family gathering in pain and confusion. I'd be coming home not as someone desperate for acceptance, but as someone who'd finally learned to accept herself. 3 months after that devastating family dinner, I received news that changed everything. The policy brief I'd been working on, an analysis of federal education funding disparities, had been forwarded to the White House Domestic Policy Council. Not only had they read it, but they were incorporating our recommendations into a major education initiative the president would be announcing the following week. The recognition was beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd started the project. My supervisor called me into her office on a Tuesday morning to deliver the news. "This doesn't happen often," she said, barely containing her excitement. "Your work is going to influence policy at the highest level. They want you there for the announcement." The President's Education Summit was being held at a major university, with an audience of educators, policy experts, and government officials. I would be one of the researchers whose work had informed the initiative, seated in the front section where the cameras could capture our reactions to the president's speech. More importantly, there would be a reception afterward where the contributing researchers would be personally recognized. I spent the week preparing, reviewing my research, and trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just career advancement, it was validation of everything I'd been working toward since college. The careful analysis that my father had dismissed as impractical theorizing was being used to shape federal policy. The dedication he'd mocked as trying too hard was being rewarded at the highest levels of government. The morning of the event, I put on my best suit and took the train to the university. The campus was buzzing with activity: Secret Service agents, media crews, officials in dark suits speaking into earpieces. I checked in at the registration table and was given a special badge identifying me as a contributing researcher. The young staffer who handed it to me smiled warmly. "Thank you for your work on the education brief," she said. It really made a difference in how we approached this initiative. Inside the auditorium, I found my assigned seat in the third row. Around me were people whose names I recognized from academic journals and policy publications, experts whose work I'd been reading and citing for years. To be included among them felt surreal, like a dream where I'd accidentally wandered into the wrong room and everyone was too polite to ask me to leave. But as the program began and the moderator introduced the research that had informed the president's initiative, I heard my name called along with the others. The work was real, the recognition was earned, and I belonged here as much as anyone else in the room. For the first time in my adult life, I felt fully confident in my place among my professional peers. When the president took the stage, the room fell completely silent. He spoke about the importance of educational equity, the need for evidence-based policy, and the value of rigorous research in addressing complex social problems. As he outlined the new initiative, I recognized pieces of my analysis woven throughout his remarks. Ideas I developed in the quiet of my apartment were now being articulated by the most powerful person in the country. This initiative wouldn't have been possible without the dedicated researchers who identified these disparities and developed practical solutions, he said, gesturing toward our section. Their work represents the best of what policy analysis can accomplish when it's driven by both intellectual rigor and genuine concern for social justice. The applause was thunderous, and I felt something I'd never experienced before: the complete absence of self-doubt. I wasn't wondering if I deserved to be there or if people were just being polite. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had earned this recognition through merit, that my work had value, and that my approach to problems was not only valid but valuable. After the speech, we were escorted to a reception in the university's faculty club. The atmosphere was relaxed but electric, with researchers and officials discussing the initiative and its potential impact. I found myself in conversations with people I'd only known as names on research papers, talking as equals about methodology and implementation strategies. Near the end of the reception, an aide approached me. "The president would like to meet you," she said simply. "He was particularly impressed with your analysis of rural funding disparities." She led me to a smaller room where the president was speaking with a few other researchers and officials. When he saw me, he smiled and extended his hand. "You must be Angela," he said, using my first name as if we were old colleagues. "Your work on rural education funding was exactly what we needed to strengthen this initiative. The data analysis was rigorous, but more importantly, you translated complex research into actionable recommendations." I managed to thank him and express my excitement about the initiative's potential impact. We spoke for several minutes about implementation challenges and the importance of continuing research to monitor outcomes. He treated me as an expert, asking thoughtful questions and listening carefully to my responses. "Keep doing this work," he said as our conversation concluded. "The country needs researchers who can bridge the gap between academia and practical policy. You have a real gift for that." As I left the reception, I felt like I was walking on air. The validation was complete and unassailable, not just from colleagues or supervisors, but from the highest level of government. My approach to work, my dedication to thoroughness, my commitment to evidence-based analysis had been recognized and valued by people who actually shaped policy. On the train ride home, I thought about my father for the first time in weeks. In 4 days, I would be attending my grandmother's birthday party, the first family gathering since that devastating dinner. Part of me was tempted to share news of the recognition, to finally have something so impressive that even he would have to acknowledge its value. But as the train pulled into the station, I realized I didn't want his acknowledgement anymore. The validation I'd received today came from people who understood the work, who could assess its merit objectively, who valued the same things I valued. His opinion had become not just irrelevant but meaningless. What could someone who'd never done meaningful policy work possibly add to the recognition I'd received from experts in the field? For the first time, I was going to a family gathering not hoping to impress him or prove him wrong, but simply as someone who knew her own worth regardless of his assessment. The person who'd left that last dinner in pain and self-doubt no longer existed. In her place was someone who'd been personally congratulated by the President of the United States for work that would improve educational opportunities for children across the country. His judgment of me as worthless hadn't just been wrong, it had been absurdly, laughably wrong. But I no longer needed him to admit his error. I had all the proof I needed of my own value, and it came from sources that actually mattered. The drive to my grandmother's house felt different this time. Instead of the familiar anxiety about navigating family dynamics and managing my father's inevitable criticism, I felt calm and centered. The person arriving at this gathering had been personally recognized by the president just 4 days earlier. Whatever happened in that living room, whatever comments were made or jokes shared at my expense, couldn't diminish what I'd accomplished. I decided not to mention the White House event unless someone specifically asked about work. This wasn't because I was ashamed or afraid of seeming like I was bragging, it was because I no longer needed their recognition to validate what I'd achieved. The moment with the president had been satisfying enough on its own, without requiring family acknowledgement to make it meaningful. My mother greeted me at the door with her usual enthusiasm, asking about the drive and whether I was hungry. The house was full of the familiar sounds and smells of family gatherings, conversations overlapping in multiple rooms, my grandmother's perfume, the particular way my aunt laughed at her own jokes. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely glad to be there. During cocktails, my cousins asked about my job and life in the city. I answered their questions naturally, without the old tendency to downplay my achievements or apologize for having interesting work. When my cousin mentioned that she'd seen something in the news about education policy, I acknowledged that my institute had contributed to some recent initiatives, but I didn't elaborate unless pressed for details. My father was in his usual form, holding court with my uncles and older male cousins, telling stories and making observations about politics and sports. He nodded when I greeted him, but didn't engage in any substantial conversation. I felt nothing about his lack of interest, not disappointment, not anger, just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that this was who he was. Dinner conversation flowed easily around topics that had nothing to do with career achievements or professional recognition. My grandmother told stories about her childhood, my aunt shared updates about her recent travels, and my cousins discussed everything from restaurants to relationships. I participated fully, enjoying the family connection without the old undercurrent of anxiety about being judged or found wanting. After dinner, while we were serving coffee and cake, the conversation turned to current events. Someone mentioned the president's recent education announcement, and my cousin asked if anyone knew what the new initiative actually involved. The moment felt perfectly timed, almost scripted. "I can explain it," I said simply. "My institute contributed to the research that shaped the policy." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the usual family gathering pauses. My mother looked proud but not surprised. She'd always believed in my capabilities, even when I doubted them myself. My cousins leaned forward with genuine interest, asking questions about how policy development worked and what the initiative would actually accomplish. But it was my father's reaction that captured everyone's attention. He'd stopped mid-conversation with my uncle, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. For the first time in my memory, he looked uncertain, almost confused, as if he was trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of the world. "You worked on something the president announced?" my uncle asked, his tone suggesting this was more significant than he'd initially realized. "The Education Equity Initiative," I confirmed. "I did the analysis of rural funding disparities that informed part of the policy framework. I was at the announcement ceremony earlier this week." The follow-up questions came quickly. How had I gotten involved? What did the research show? Had I actually met the president? I answered matter-of-factly, describing the work and the recognition without false modesty, but also without overselling the significance. The facts spoke for themselves. My father remained silent throughout this exchange, but I could see him processing what he was hearing. His daughter, the one he dismissed as completely worthless, had just revealed that she'd been personally involved in shaping federal policy and had been recognized at the highest levels of government. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face. When the conversation moved on to other topics, I noticed him watching me differently. Gone was the casual dismissal, the subtle mockery, the automatic assumption that whatever I was doing couldn't be very important. In its place was something I'd never seen from him before, a kind of wary respect, as if he was reevaluating fundamental assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. But the most surprising thing was how little his changed perception mattered to me. For months earlier, this moment would have felt like complete vindication, the ultimate proof that I'd been worthy of respect all along. Now, it felt almost anticlimactic. I'd already received the validation that mattered from people whose judgment I trusted. His belated recognition was too little and far too late. As the evening wound down and people began preparing to leave, my father approached me for the first time all evening. "That's quite an accomplishment," he said, his voice careful and formal. "I had no idea you were working on something so significant." I looked at him for a moment, this man who'd shaped so much of my internal dialogue for so many years. He was offering me something, not exactly an apology, but an acknowledgement that he'd been wrong about me. 6 months earlier, I would have been desperate for this recognition, willing to rebuild our relationship based on his newfound respect. Instead, I simply said, "Thank you," and turned to help my mother gather plates from the coffee table. His acknowledgement felt hollow, motivated by external validation rather than genuine appreciation for who I was. I no longer wanted a relationship based on his assessment of my achievements. I wanted authentic connection or nothing at all. As I drove home that night, I realized that something had fundamentally shifted. I'd proven everything I'd ever needed to prove, not to him but to myself. The girl who'd spent years seeking his approval was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and chose her own validators. His opinion, positive or negative, had become irrelevant to my understanding of myself. The final irony wasn't lost on me. In the moment when he was finally ready to acknowledge my value, I no longer needed him to. I'd found validation from sources that actually mattered, respect from people who understood my work, and, most importantly, confidence in my own judgment that didn't require external confirmation. For days after that family dinner, I received a call that would cement everything I'd been building toward. The White House Domestic Policy Council wanted to offer me a position as a senior policy analyst, working directly on education initiatives. The role would involve developing research frameworks for major policy decisions and briefing senior administration officials on implementation strategies. The opportunity was beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd started my career in policy work. It represented not just professional advancement, but acknowledgement that my approach to research and analysis was valued at the highest levels of government. The careful, methodical work style that my father had always dismissed as overthinking was exactly what they needed for complex policy development. I accepted the position immediately, knowing it was the culmination of everything I'd been working toward since college. The job would begin in 6 weeks, giving me time to transition my current projects and relocate to Washington. My supervisor was thrilled for me, describing the opportunity as a perfect match for my skills and interests. "You're going to do important work there," she said as we discussed the transition. "They need people who can bridge the gap between rigorous research and practical policy implementation. That's exactly what you do best." The validation felt complete and unassailable. I'd built a career based on my natural strengths, surrounded myself with people who appreciated my approach to work, and earned recognition from institutions that actually mattered. My father's assessment of me as worthless hadn't just been wrong, it had been spectacularly, publicly wrong. But the most satisfying part wasn't proving him wrong, it was realizing that his opinion no longer had any power over my self-perception. I'd found my place in the world, discovered work that aligned with my values and utilized my strengths, and built relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need for approval. When I called my mother to share the news about the White House position, she was overwhelmed with pride and excitement. I always knew you were capable of great things, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Your dedication and hard work have finally been recognized at the level they deserve. She didn't put my father on the phone, and I didn't ask to speak with him. His congratulations, if they came at all, would be motivated by the impressiveness of the title rather than genuine appreciation for my capabilities. I no longer wanted validation that was based solely on external markers of success. Over the following weeks, as I prepared for the transition, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The path from that devastating family dinner to this career breakthrough had been shorter than I'd expected, but it had required a fundamental shift in how I understood my own worth. I'd stopped seeking approval from someone incapable of giving it and started building relationships with people who could appreciate who I actually was. The work ahead would be challenging and meaningful, exactly the kind of environment where I thrived. I'd be developing policy frameworks that could affect millions of people, working with experts who shared my commitment to evidence-based analysis, contributing to initiatives that aligned with my deepest values about social justice and educational equity. As I packed my apartment and prepared for the move to Washington, I thought about the girl who'd spent so many years trying to prove herself to someone who'd already decided she wasn't worth his respect. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who'd learned to validate herself through meaningful work and authentic relationships. The final conversation with my father came during my last visit home before the move. He'd asked to speak with me privately, leading me to his study where he closed the door and turned to face me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between pride and regret. "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished," he said, his voice unusually subdued. "The White House position is quite an honor. I may not have always expressed it well, but I've always wanted you to succeed." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd shaped so much of my self-doubt and determination. He was offering me something, not exactly an apology, but an attempt to rewrite our history in a way that cast him as a supportive father who'd simply been misunderstood. "Thank you," I said finally. "I appreciate that." But I didn't elaborate or engage with his revisionist narrative. The truth was too clear and too painful to pretend away. He'd spent years systematically undermining my confidence, dismissing my achievements, and describing me as worthless to other family members. His belated pride was too little and far too late. The conversation ended awkwardly, with both of us aware that something fundamental had shifted, but neither willing to name it directly. I'd outgrown his ability to hurt me, and he'd lost the power to validate me. What remained was a polite but distant relationship based on family obligation rather than genuine connection. As I drove away from that house for the last time as someone seeking his approval, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete freedom from his judgment. I was heading toward work that mattered, recognition that was earned, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than desperate need. The girl who'd been devastated by his cruelty was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned to measure her worth by her own standards, who'd found her place among people who appreciated her strengths, and who'd discovered that the most meaningful validation comes not from those who should love you unconditionally, but from those who choose to respect you based on who you actually are. His assessment of me as worthless had been more than wrong, it had been irrelevant. And finally, after all these years, I understood that his opinion had always been about his limitations, never about my worth. And that's how the moment my father called me worthless turned into the day the president shook my hand. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family, or had someone close to you dismiss your worth? How did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs the reminder that their value isn't defined by anyone else.